In the suburban neighborhood of Coral Gardens, Miami, where vibrant communities meet tension and suspicion, a forbidden affair took a dark turn that ended in a horrifying murder. Set in 2011, this is the story of Daniel Perez, a 26-year-old Venezuelan immigrant with dreams of building a new life, who found himself tangled in a tragic web of love, envy, and racial tension that shattered a family and shocked the community. What seemed like an illicit romance soon spiraled into a tale of deceit and a chilling crime that left everyone asking, what really happened in Coral Gardens? Daniel Perez arrived in Miami from Venezuela in late 2010 with only a few belongings and a heart full of hope. Coral Gardens was a far cry from his bustling hometown of Valencia. In Miami, he found himself surrounded by a quieter, more restrained world, one where people rarely made eye contact with him, and neighbors whispered from behind closed doors. For Daniel, it was a bittersweet reality. He had come to America to escape the escalating political tensions and economic instability back home. Still, he found himself yearning for the warm, familiar hum of his homeland, the feeling of community that Coral Gardens seemed to lack. Daniel was a skilled mechanic and quickly found a job at a modest car garage a few miles from Coral Gardens. Each day, he rode his old bicycle along the same roads, enduring the humid Miami mornings and cool nights. He worked tirelessly, fixing engines and tuning cars with unmatched precision, dreaming of one day owning his own garage. He kept his head down, aware of the wary glances from his neighbors, most of whom viewed him as a stranger in their tight-knit suburban world. The few who greeted him often did so with forced politeness, avoiding further conversation, while others barely acknowledged his presence. Daniel endured all of it with silent resilience, pushing past the looks and whispers, finding solace in his work and a small but growing circle of friends at the garage. His co-workers admired his dedication and skill, yet even there, Daniel felt the subtle undertone of distance that he could never quite bridge. Still, he worked hard and kept to himself, determined to build a life in America that would honor the sacrifices he'd made. Across the street from Daniel's modest apartment complex lived Maria Evans. Born and raised in Puerto Rico, Maria had come to the mainland with dreams of her own, imagining a life filled with love, laughter, and purpose. In her early 20s, she married Robert Evans, a man she'd met on a trip to New York. At the time, Robert seemed like everything she could have wanted: successful, confident, and ambitious. He was a banker with a promising career, and he promised her a comfortable life in Miami. But by 2011, Maria felt as if she were merely a shadow in Robert's life. Robert's long hours at work left her alone in their large, well-decorated home. Over time, she realized that their relationship had little substance. He valued her for her beauty and the stability she provided rather than for the person she was. Robert's words often carried a sting, subtle but sharp, reminding Maria that he held the power in their lives. Her role, it seemed, was to simply look the part of a dutiful wife while remaining invisible to him and to everyone else around her. Over the years, Maria's vibrant spirit began to dim, replaced by a quiet loneliness that settled into her daily routine. She spent her days completing chores and running errands, filling the silence of her home with the hum of her own thoughts. She longed for a connection, for a conversation that wasn't merely superficial pleasantries, But Robert, even when home, was distant, and their interactions were brief, often laced with criticism and veiled resentment. Maria began to feel more like a beautiful piece of decor than a partner. Her loneliness was a constant ache, and in moments of despair, she wondered how her life had veered so far from the dreams she'd once envisioned. Their paths crossed for the first time on a clear Saturday morning in late February of 2011. Daniel had spent the morning fixing his bicycle when Maria approached him on the sidewalk, intending to ask about a minor car issue. At first it was a simple exchange, brief and polite, but Maria noticed something in Daniel's eyes, a warmth, a spark of kindness that she hadn't seen in years. Over the following weeks, their encounters grew more frequent, and with each interaction, the invisible wall of restraint between them began to crumble. Daniel found himself drawn to Maria's soft-spoken demeanor, and she to his gentle, patient nature. They exchanged stories of their backgrounds, Maria confiding in him about her Puerto Rican heritage, and Daniel sharing snippets of his life back in Venezuela. Through these conversations, they found common ground, both being outsiders in a community that felt rigid and unwelcoming. To Maria, Daniel represented a glimpse of the life she had lost, the sense of cultural familiarity and warmth that had vanished from her world. On weekdays when Robert was at work, Maria would stroll to the car garage under the pretense of getting her vehicle checked or consulting about repairs. Daniel, always eager to help, offered his time, showing her simple fixes and teaching her about engines in a way that felt genuine and patient. Each conversation felt like an oasis in the desert of their lives, a place where they could be themselves without judgment. Over time, Maria began to visit him at his apartment on quiet afternoons, bringing homemade dishes and staying for coffee as they laughed over memories of their childhoods and shared tales of their struggles in America. By early March, their connection had grown beyond friendship, slipping into the realm of forbidden passion. Their encounters became filled with subtle glances, lingering touches, and an intensity that Maria hadn't felt in years. The closeness they shared made her feel alive again, as if she had been awakened from a long, dark sleep. Each visit to Daniel's apartment became a stolen moment of happiness, an escape from the confines of her stifling marriage. Yet, even as their affair deepened, they both knew they were walking a dangerous path. Unbeknownst to them, their clandestine meetings had not gone unnoticed. Coral Gardens was a community of watchful eyes, and soon enough, neighbors began to notice Maria's frequent visits to Daniel's apartment. Whispers circulated, the immigrant and the wife, their encounters adding fuel to the existing undercurrent of resentment toward Daniel, who was already seen as an outsider. Neighbors eyed him with suspicion, murmuring that he was nothing more than a home wrecker and a troublemaker. Yet Maria and Daniel, lost in the thrill and solace of each other's company, paid little heed to the growing scrutiny around them. Each visit felt more necessary than the last, a fleeting sense of freedom that neither was willing to relinquish. For Maria, the time with Daniel became a reprieve from her hollow marriage, a space where she could feel valued, where she was seen for who she truly was. And for Daniel, it was an oasis of warmth in an otherwise cold and indifferent world. By mid-March, the tension around their affair had reached a peak. Neighbors glared openly at Daniel, muttering words he could barely understand but felt the sting of. They began avoiding eye contact with him at the garage or in the community's grocery store, making him feel even more isolated than before. He knew that Coral Gardens viewed him as an outsider, a disruptor in the carefully curated neighborhood. But his heart was already too entangled in his connection with Maria to turn back. Despite knowing the risks, Maria continued visiting Daniel, seeking the connection that she had been starved of for so long. Each visit held the weight of unspoken consequences, a looming threat that was now palpable in the air. As the days passed, their connection took on a bittersweet edge, each shared moment tainted by the fear of discovery, the awareness that their secret could destroy them both. But for Maria and Daniel, their affair felt like the only real thing in their lives, a small but fiercely guarded spark in the darkness of their separate worlds. Thus, in the quiet moments they shared, neither spoke of the possible repercussions. They were simply two people, caught between the need for connection and the inevitable tragedy their union would bring. By late February 2011, the tension between Maria and her husband Robert had reached a boiling point. Robert Evans, a man fiercely proud of his status and reputation, began noticing the subtle yet unmistakable shifts around him. His neighbors, the ones who usually nodded with approval at him and his family, now offered cold stares, barely concealed with thin smiles. The whispers he caught here and there seemed laced with a knowing edge. At home, Maria seemed distracted, her once eager disposition subdued. Her energy was distant, detached, and her once dutiful compliance now felt forced. The usual rapport and mild conversation they shared became terse exchanges, the silences stretching longer with each passing day. On March 1st, Robert's unease reached a peak when, during a community gathering, a neighbor's offhand remark about outsiders encroaching on the neighborhood seemed directed right at him. The words pierced his already troubled mind, amplifying his suspicions. That night, he watched Maria with renewed intensity, his mind racing to put the pieces together. As he observed her, he noticed her every action, the slight nervousness in her laughter, the way her eyes darted away from his, the tension in her posture. By the next morning, his suspicions had hardened into certainty. Robert felt humiliated, convinced that someone was undermining his role as a husband, someone from outside his world, someone who didn't belong in his life. On March 2nd, Robert confronted Maria. His anger, though controlled, seethed beneath the surface. Under the weight of his accusatory gaze, Maria hesitated but eventually confessed to the affair. Her admission struck him with a force he had never anticipated. There, in their spacious living room, filled with relics of their life together, Robert's world shattered. The air was thick with the tension of unspoken words, and Maria could feel the weight of Robert's wounded pride and barely contained fury. In his mind, her affair was not only a betrayal, but a direct affront to his pride, his dignity, and his carefully constructed image. That night, a cold rage settled over Robert. He couldn't stomach the thought of Daniel Perez, the man he now considered an intruder and a threat, taking what was rightfully his. His thoughts turned dark as resentment and a deep-seated disdain for Daniel, a foreigner in his life, solidified. By the March 3rd, Robert had devised a plan. He resolved to catch Maria with Danielle, to confront them both and claim back his honor in a way that would leave no doubt about his control over his own life. On the March 4th, Robert followed Maria, who unwittingly led him straight to Daniel's modest apartment. The evening was quiet as he parked down the street, watching her approach the building. As he stood in the shadows observing them from afar, Robert's anger intensified. The reality of Maria's betrayal, her presence in another man's home, brought his resentment to a fever pitch. At that moment, all of his emotions, anger, jealousy, and contempt, converged into a singular desire to reclaim what he believed had been taken from him. Inside Daniel's apartment, Maria and Daniel were caught off guard by the sudden arrival of Robert, whose presence filled the room with an air of confrontation. The tension was suffocating, and the moment swelled with the weight of unspoken accusations, and accusations barely held back. Robert's anger was palpable, his words searing and direct as he confronted them, his disdain for Daniel stark and bitter. He hurled words like daggers, his tone laced with a scorn that cut into both Maria and Daniel. Maria stood paralyzed, her horror growing as she witnessed the depths of Robert's anger. She knew that her confession had betrayed her life's one reprieve, the small piece of happiness she'd found with Daniel. And in that moment, it all began to unravel. Daniel, though initially taken aback, faced Robert with defiance. He saw the disdain in Robert's eyes, the underlying prejudice that added fuel to the anger. Daniel, who had endured the community's whispered judgments and Robert's cold disregard, now found himself face to face with the unspoken hatred that had always loomed between them. He could sense that to Robert, he was not merely a rival, but an unwanted outsider, someone who, in Robert's mind, had no right to even exist in his world. Daniel stood his ground, unwilling to let Robert's accusations undermine him, even as the intensity of the confrontation escalated. As the standoff continued, Robert's fury became unbearable. His words, once veiled, were now a torrent of resentment that struck both Maria and Daniel with a devastating force. Finally, Robert stormed out, leaving a chill in the air. Maria was left shaken, fearing the consequences that would follow, and Daniel, though resolute, felt the full weight of the situation he now found himself entangled in. Robert's parting vow, echoing in the silence, promised retribution, a revenge that would strike fear into them both. On the evening of March 6th, Coral Gardens was jolted awake by the sound of a piercing scream. Neighbors heard frantic noises coming from Daniel's apartment, the loud thud of furniture overturning, and the sound of desperate struggle. One of the neighbors, uneasy but uncertain, called the police, describing the sounds with trembling apprehension. When authorities arrived, they found a scene that would haunt them, a brutal and horrific sight that spoke of unrestrained hatred and violence. Daniel lay motionless on the floor of his small apartment, his body bearing the brutal marks of an attack driven by pure rage. He had been beaten and stabbed multiple times, evidence of his attempts to defend himself visible in the scattered, broken remnants of his belongings. Blood stained the walls, an eerie reminder of the chaos that had unfolded in his final moments. To the police, the scene was an unmistakable symbol of raw personal hatred. Every wound seemed to carry the weight of emotions far deeper than mere anger. The detectives quickly focused on the Robert Evans. Though he had attempted to maintain his alibi, surveillance footage revealed his car near Daniel's apartment that night, casting doubt on his claims. Moreover, upon inspecting him, detectives noticed faint bruises on his knuckles, signs that betrayed the violent struggle he had endured. The mounting evidence against Robert pointed to him as the primary suspect, a man who had let his pride and jealousy evolve into a crime of passion. On the March 8th, Detective Carla Martinez conducted the first interrogation. Seasoned and sharp-eyed, she scrutinized Robert, whose controlled demeanor did little to mask the underlying tension. Robert claimed he had only gone to talk sense into Daniel, brushing off any suggestion of confrontation. But Detective Martinez sensed the cold detachment in his tone as he recounted the events, as if speaking about strangers rather than people close to him. Her years in the force had shown her many forms of anger, but rarely did she encounter such a chilling mixture of resentment and denial. 2 days later, on March the 10th, Maria was called in for questioning. The weight of recent events bore heavily upon her, her appearance weary and distraught. She described the affair, speaking in a voice heavy with remorse, though she maintained that she had not anticipated the violence that would follow. Maria recounted how Robert's anger had left her feeling vulnerable and cornered, but she insisted that she never believed he was capable of such brutality. She trembled as she remembered the night of March 4th, her fear growing as she recounted the veiled threats Robert had hurled in the heat of the confrontation. Her regret and sorrow painted a picture of a woman caught in a devastating whirlwind of choices and consequences. Detective Martinez noted Maria's despair, sensing the complexity of her emotions, guilt, fear, and the deep sorrow that stemmed from her role in Daniel's life. Though Maria denied any foreknowledge of Robert's intent, the detectives found it difficult to disregard her connection to both men. Her emotional turmoil raised questions, but it also evoked an understanding of her suffering, of the love and the pain that had bound her to Daniel and left her scarred in the aftermath of his death. By mid-March, the case against Robert Evans had reached a critical point. The police had meticulously gathered evidence, and the detectives pieced together the narrative of a man consumed by jealousy, anger, and prejudice. On the March 20th, the weight of the investigation finally closed in on Robert. Under immense pressure from both law enforcement and the media, Robert was officially charged with the murder of Daniel Perez. As the news broke, Coral Gardens fell into a mix of shock and grim satisfaction, the quiet suburb, now a place of murmurs and judgments that reflected the deeply conflicted emotions within the community. The defense's immediate strategy was to present Robert as a victim of momentary rage, a husband who, overwhelmed by the betrayal of his wife's affair, had acted in a single, impulsive lapse of judgment. But the prosecution quickly uncovered a different story, bringing to light a disturbing layer of evidence that painted Robert as someone driven by a darker prejudice. Hidden in emails, text messages, and notes were phrases that betrayed his long-standing contempt for Daniel as just another immigrant trying to take what isn't his. These words cut deeply, revealing a simmering resentment that went beyond the affair, rooted in Robert's view of Daniel not only as a rival, but as an outsider infringing on his life and his place in society. The exposure of Robert's private sentiments intensified the public's reaction, further dividing Coral Gardens. For some, the messages confirmed a troubling truth they had suspected all along, that Robert's actions were fueled by more than betrayal alone. But there were also those who quietly sympathized with Robert, convinced that the affair itself justified his anger. As the days passed, Coral Gardens became a place of whispered conversations, each resident choosing a side as they dissected the tragedy that had forever changed their neighborhood. The trial began in late April, drawing extensive media coverage. News outlets detailed every aspect of the case, presenting Robert as a figure consumed by toxic pride and wounded pride. The courtroom was filled each day with curious onlookers, members of the press, and neighbors from Coral Gardens who arrived to watch the proceedings, captivated by the unraveling of a story that was both sensational and deeply unsettling. The prosecution focused on portraying Robert's deep-seated contempt for Daniel, using his messages as evidence of a resentment that had festered long before the affair was uncovered. They presented Robert as a man whose sense of self was rooted in control over his life, his family, and his reputation. To Robert, Daniel was more than a romantic rival. He was a symbol of everything Robert feared and despised. A man who didn't belong, whose presence in his life had undermined his authority. Witnesses were called to paint a fuller picture of Robert's character. Friends and neighbors described him as a proud man, fiercely protective of his image. But when Maria took the stand, her testimony laid bare the complex emotions at the heart of the case. She spoke about her marriage, detailing the years of control and restraint she had endured, the life that had slowly chipped away at her spirit. Her words reflected the isolation that had driven her to seek connection with Daniel, a man who made her feel valued in a way she hadn't felt in years. Maria's testimony highlighted Robert's need for control, a need that, once shattered, had spiraled into a desperate act of violence. Robert's defense lawyer countered by trying to evoke sympathy, painting Robert as a husband pushed to the edge by his wife's betrayal. He argued that Robert's actions were those of a man who had momentarily lost control, driven to a breaking point by emotions that any betrayed spouse might understand. But the emails and messages weakened this portrayal, casting a shadow over the defense's narrative. As the prosecution highlighted the layers of prejudice and rage behind Robert's actions, it became harder to view him as a man simply wronged by fate. For 2 weeks, the trial gripped the community, each day peeling back layers of resentment, betrayal, and unspoken animosities that had been simmering in Coral Gardens for years. The jury, tasked with weighing the evidence, deliberated for hours. They were forced to confront the duality of Robert's actions, the crime of passion, and the racism that had fueled it. When they returned with their verdict, Robert Evans was found guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was swift and unyielding: life imprisonment. The verdict brought a wave of complex emotions to Coral Gardens. Some residents felt relief, satisfied that justice had been served for Daniel Perez, a man many had come to view as a tragic victim of both personal and societal prejudice. Others whispered among themselves, voicing quiet dissatisfaction, convinced that Robert had been unfairly condemned, that his actions, though extreme, were born of justifiable rage. But no matter where they stood, all were left grappling with the outcome, a verdict that seemed to echo through the community with lasting resonance. As the media attention faded and life in Coral Gardens resumed, the impact of Daniel's murder and Robert's conviction lingered, casting a shadow over the neighborhood. Daniel's family, devastated by the loss, struggled to find closure. They mourned a man who had come to America seeking a better life, only to find prejudice and hostility that ultimately led to his death. His absence left a void that could never be filled, a reminder of the tragedy that had befallen an immigrant striving to belong. Maria, too, was left to face the repercussions of her choices. The affair, once her refuge from a loveless marriage, had now become a source of deep shame and regret. Shunned by some in the community and pitied by others, she found herself isolated, grappling with the weight of the events that had destroyed her family. Her marriage was in shambles, her husband gone, and her life forever marred by the affair and its deadly aftermath. Friends distanced themselves, reluctant to engage with the woman at the center of Coral Garden's darkest scandal. For the community, the murder and trial exposed underlying tensions that had long been ignored. Immigrant families, especially those who had quietly supported Daniel, felt the sting of prejudice more keenly than ever, aware that their acceptance in Coral Gardens was fragile, conditional. They gathered privately to remember Daniel, holding quiet vigils and prayer services that honored his life and mourned his untimely death. Their gatherings became both a remembrance and a silent protest against the prejudice that had ultimately contributed to his murder. Yet, in stark contrast, there were those in Coral Gardens who still believed that Robert's actions, though extreme, were rooted in a legitimate grievance. In their minds, Daniel had trespassed into a life he did not belong in, and they whispered of justice, as though Robert's punishment was a betrayal of a community's unwritten code. These conflicting sentiments left Coral Gardens a divided place, a neighborhood that had once prided itself on unity, but was now fractured along lines of loyalty and bias. As time passed, Coral Gardens attempted to heal, but the memory of the crime remained, a story shared in hushed tones by neighbors who had lived through it, a tragedy that had stripped away the illusion of unity and revealed the fragile fabric of a community built on unspoken divides. Things spiraled out of control. In this case, just like the case where a Hollywood actress' secret affair with a famous director ends wrong. Don't forget to like the video and check out the case about the actress and her director. I'm sure you'd love it.